This would actually be a horrible candle to burn because there's no single wick that is thick enough to burn all of the wax from this end all the way over to this end. So basically the center is going to melt, but the rest of the candle won't. But that's okay with me because I don't actually plan to burn the candle that I'm gonna make today using this mold. I'm just gonna use it as a decor piece. And if I wanted to make it a functional candle, I would probably have to put multiple wicks along the top of this arch. But I'm not gonna do that because I think it would ruin the look. And I actually do have a mold that makes a lot more sense. This one right here, it's a lot more compact, so I do have a wick that is thick enough to burn the entire candle, but I actually prefer the look of this wider arch right here, so that's what I'm gonna make today. So this candle was a dud, so I'm going to throw it into the melting pitcher to basically recycle the wax for the new candle I'm making today, along with some additional wax because I'll need more to fill out the whole mold. And when I made this taper candle, I knew that it was gonna come out with these tiny little holes on the surface because there were a bunch of air bubbles in the melted wax, and that can happen when you stir the wax too much or pour too fast. It can introduce air bubbles and then the candle will cure with these little holes on the surface. And I just wasn't paying attention when I made this. So I'm going to recycle the wax, and I'm also gonna save this wick for a future taper candle, hopefully with fewer bubbles next time. And I'm using a combination of beeswax and soy wax. If I'm making a container candle, I would just use soy wax. But when I make candles using a mold, I use beeswax and soy wax because soy by itself would be too soft. And since this candle has to support itself and isn't surrounded by a container, it really needs a harder wax like beeswax. But I find beeswax kind of hard to work with, so adding a little bit of soy to it just helps soften it up a little bit, makes it easier to work with. I just like the way that it cures a lot better than beeswax by itself. I'm also throwing in some stearic acid, and this is an additive that you can use in candle making to do all kinds of things, but one of the things I like is that it tends to make the color more opaque, and since I'm making a black candle today, I think it'll help it look better. Typically, I don't like to use too much dye because that can clog the wick and lead to issues with burning. But again, I'm not planning on burning the candle that I'm making today, so I do have the benefit of being able to use as much dye as I want and stearic acid to help make the color more opaque. And so hopefully I'll get a true black candle and not something that looks kind of gray or just kind of lighter than I want it to be. So I'm gonna break this candle up and throw it in. And I'm just gonna leave that wick in there. It's gonna end up melting and I can just pick it out later. And then I'm going to add in my soy wax and my beeswax. I actually probably should have added my beeswax first because it takes longer for beeswax to melt. So I should have put it on the bottom, but that's okay. And then I'm going to add my stearic acid. Okay. And now I can put that on my burner. I'm just going to add a little bit of water to the bottom of the pot. And then I'll put the melting pitcher in and I'll turn the heat on. And now all I have to do is wait for that to melt. And while that is melting, I can prep the mold. I've used this mold before, so I've already poked holes in the top and bottom at the center. And you can see where I've marked off the center here. And if I stick a toothpick through the bottom, you can see where I'm going to string the wick through. So normally I would match the wick size to the size of the mold that I'm using. So I would use a thicker wick for a wider mold. But in this case, the wick doesn't matter because I won't actually be burning this candle. And so even though this is the thickest wick size I have on hand, it's only for candles with a 2-inch diameter. So that would definitely not cover this whole thing. And I'm actually going to not use the thickest wick I have. I'm going to use this one right here. Again, not burning this candle, so I can kind of do whatever I want here. And I'm just going to string it through. I like this mold a lot because I don't have to use a wick bar to hold anything in place. All I have to do is string it through and make sure it's pulled tight. Okay, I'm just gonna cut it off right here. And that's all I have to do to prep the mold. If I were using a hard mold, I would have to spray the inside with a mold release spray or coconut oil so that the candle would slip out easier at the end. But I love using these soft molds because all you have to do is kind of manipulate it and the candle pops right out. So I don't have to do anything else with this mold. All I have to do is wait for my wax to melt. This looks melted now, so I'm gonna pick out the wick from the recycled candle, and then I'm gonna add the liquid dye. So I can reuse that later. And I'm gonna add this liquid dye. Actually, let me get you a little closer. That is way more dye than I would typically use, but again, I'm not burning this candle, so I don't have to worry about it clogging the wick. And instead of stirring the candle, I prefer to just kind of move the melting pitcher like this so that the dye mixes into the melted wax without introducing any air bubbles. When I made that taper candle that I showed you, the one that I recycled for this candle, I was taking shortcuts. So I just stirred the wax a bunch and didn't take the time to do this step, which always gives me better results. So I should do this every time. And before I actually pour the candle, I do need to test the color to make sure it's as dark as I want it to be. So I always test it using a white piece of paper. It's hard to see what the actual final color is going to be while it's in the melting pitcher. So I just take something that I can put a few dots onto white paper with, and then I see what color it is. And I can see that this isn't fully mixed in. So I'm gonna have to be a little bit more patient. It looks a little spotty, so I have to do a little bit more mixing before I can actually pour this. Okay, so I'm gonna try again. I'm just gonna take a little bit of this and put it on the card, just an index card. And I don't think this is as opaque as I want it to be. It's looking more gray than black, so I'm gonna add more dye. And at this point, the candle wax is cooling down, which is a good thing and a bad thing. So I don't want to pour this into the mold while it's piping hot. That actually leads to sinkholes and other issues with the candle. Well, at least I've found that if I let the candle cool down to about 155, I guess I should say 155 degrees Fahrenheit, not Celsius. But if I let it cool down to 155, I tend to get better results. So right now, if I had to guess, it's probably at 170. I could put the thermometer back in to verify that, but if I had to guess, it's probably at 170 right now. And as it cools down, it's actually not the best for mixing the color in. So I might have to add this back to the heat for a few more minutes while the color just kind of mixes into the melted wax, and then I'll pull it back out again to cool down to 155 before I pour. Okay, so now I'm gonna test this again to see if I've gotten a better color. So it looks better. It's darker than it was before, but it's not mixed well. I can still see that it's a little bit spotty. So this was the last time I checked it, and this is this time. It's definitely gotten darker, as you can see, but it's still a little bit spotty, so I need to mix it in a little bit better, and I am gonna add a few more drops of dye. Again, I would never do this for a candle that I intended to burn because it's definitely gonna clog the wick, but I want this to just be an intense black color, so I just wanna make absolute sure it's not gonna come out gray. And because this has cooled down a little bit, I'm gonna add it back to the heat after I mix it in, just to make sure that I get the final color that I want. And this is why I typically don't make dark colored candles like black or navy blue or a deep purple, because it just takes so much testing of the color to make sure it's exactly what I want, and balancing the desire to put more dye in with the desire to make a candle that's actually going to burn nicely. I don't know if there's more intense candle dye out there that would help me get the look that I want without having to put so much in. But yeah, that's kind of the tricky balance that I'm trying to strike when I'm adding so much dye to the mixture. Okay, so this is probably good, but I'm gonna add it to the heat for a few more minutes just to make sure that everything mixes really well, and then I'm gonna test the color one more time and then I will pour. Okay, so I think I'm probably ready to pour. I just wanna test the color one more time to make sure I'm on the right track. Okay, that is perfect. That's exactly what I want to see. So that's where we started, and as you can see, compared to where we ended up, it's a lot more gray. So I'm glad I kept going because that is the look I'm going for, and this is why I always test on an index card before I pour. So now I'm ready. I put the thermometer back in just so you can see the temperature, and this melted at about 180. So as you can see, it's come down to about 155, 160, which is where I like to finally pour the wax into the mold. I can do a whole video about why you want to pour at a cooler temperature than you actually melt. But for right now, as you can see, I'm at the point where I'm ready to pour. So let's get into it. This is my favorite step.